AI, in the travel, here we go. Got that AI on the low, taking flights to and fro, booking trips in a snap with a simple chatbot flow. AI, revolutionizing how we roll. Gonna hop on a plane.
Welcome to another episode of the Everything AI in Travel podcast, where we hear from the makers, shapers, and buyers of AI technology in the travel space. Here's your host, Tony Khan.
Hey everyone. Now, before we get started with today's show, I've got a very special guest with me who's got an event coming up later in the year that I think you should consider attending. Welcome to the show, Mr. Bruce Rassard from Arrival. How are you going?
Hey, thanks, Tony. Really appreciate the time. So Arrival, for those who aren't familiar with us, focuses on destination experiences, what you do when you get there on vacation. We all know that people don't go on trips to stay in a hotel or fly. They go to have fun when they get to destination. So that's what Arrival is all about. At our conference this year in Washington, D.C., September 29 to October 3rd, we actually have three different elements. First, we have our executive summit for the C-suite. Then the second day is our AI forum for destination experiences. It's the first of its kind. It's never happened. And we've got a great group of speakers that are going to be there to talk about the intermediate up to expert level of what people know about AI, not designed for beginners. We will have some sessions at Arrival 360, which follows the AI forum for more introductory AI.
Sounds really great, Bruce. Now, what can people expect to take away or learn from going to the AI specific part of the conference?
You know, at the AI conference, Tony, we're going to have high-level strategic discussions on our main stage, everything from agents and what's happening with that, the impact of AI on search and discovery, what you need to know from a regulatory and privacy perspective. That'll be on the main stage and more sessions like that. Some investors will be there sharing their perspective. And then we'll have breakout sessions where we're going to go deep again into search and discovery because we know how important that is. Agents, working with agents, and roll up your sleeves, bring your laptop, hour and a half long sessions on the tools. You know, we know what tools everyone's using today. By the time the event runs around in September, it'll be different. And we'll have roundtables with discussions for practical information. Here's some tools you need to start using today. By tomorrow, you can start using them.
Sounds super fantastic. I'm definitely going to be there. Where can people find out some more information?
Just go to arrival.travel and navigate your way to our Washington event. And you'll see subtitles for our executive summit and our AI forum and the rest of the conference that's going on that first week of October in DC.
Perfect. Now, there's a special offer for listeners of the Everything AI and Travel podcast, and you'll find that in the show notes. So if that sounded like something that you would like to attend, and I think you should, then go down to those show notes and grab that special offer, find out more about the conference and book yourself a ticket. Thanks for joining us today, Bruce.
Yeah, one last thing. It's Arrival with one R. For those of you listening, arrival.travel.
Perfect. Thanks for joining us, Bruce. And now on with the show. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Everything AI in Travel podcast. And I've got a founder from down under where I am. Welcome to the show, Mr. Richard Savoie. How are you going?
Yeah, really well, Tony. Thanks for having me.
No worries. Now, you are in my part of the world, but I twig an accent that may make me think that you're not actually from here originally. Whereabouts you're from and how have you ended up in Australia?
Well, before you panic, I am indeed an Australian citizen now.
Perfect.
I was not born that way, but I corrected the mistakes of my past when I could. So
Welcome aboard.
Thank you. Good to be here. No disrespect to my home country. I'm originally from the US and from Boston, the Boston area, and moved here about 15 years ago, 2010. My wife got a job offer here and we decided to come for quote unquote a year. And that year has now turned into 15, dual citizenship, kids, the whole lot. So proud to be an Aussie now.
Fantastic. And how do you find it? And how do you find the differences between where you kind of grew up and where you are now?
Look, I still have a lot of love for America. I love going back there to travel. I love going back there to visit family and friends, obviously. And also, from a travel context, it is one of the most exciting places in the world to travel because there's just so much to see and do and diversity of people to talk to. And, culturally, despite what some people might assume about Americans, they are, one of the chattiest, friendliest types of people in the world, especially if you're from another country. They can come off a bit gruff sometimes, maybe a bit aggressive sometimes to certain cultures, but they don't mean it. They don't mean any harm by it. Your typical New Yorker is just as likely to push you aside to get somewhere. But if you fall over, they'll help you back up. Like it's that type of a culture.
For sure. It's a place I love traveling to, being there many times, and looking forward to getting back very shortly and going to the Arrival conference in DC at the start of October, and hopefully be taking my daughter over and showing her a little bit around the east coast of the US. And it's a place I love going to and always have a great time. Now, you are a founder of a company here in Australia, and we'll dig into that a little bit more, but when you thought about first founding a company, the difference between starting something in Australia versus starting something in the US, the US has a lot greater advantages in the startup world. Was that a consideration for you? Did you ever think about going back to do your startup, anything like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are some very big differences for founding a company in terms of access to capital and access to markets. Just the sheer size of the American market means it's much easier to quickly get customer validation and start to have lots of conversations in a market, especially in what we're doing in supply chain, which is a niche within a niche. Despite being such an enormous industry, it is very specialized. So no, we never really thought about going back to the US to found it, but we did have to think very carefully about how quickly we try to enter into some of those bigger overseas markets. So the US, Europe, South America, as well as a massive market here. And obviously we're on the doorstep of Asia and, big Asian markets like China, but also Southeast Asia, which is a massive opportunity for a company like us. So we did a lot of work. In fact, I had a grad student that was doing nothing but market analysis to determine, well, where do we go next, and what kind of resources and support will we need? How much capital might we need to fundraise? And a lot of that got put to the side because we were very lucky to meet a US venture capital company that was talking at a conference here in Sydney. And, classic founder mentality, where I chased them through the lobby of the venue and cornered them and said, I need to pitch you my startup, and forced them to listen to me for 30 seconds until they were able to pull themselves away from me. But it turns out they were interested enough that we had a follow up. And eventually, this is about 2019. We just started doing a little bit of work, and it was enough that they led our pre-seed investment in 2020, which was what kept us alive through COVID when we started. Now, all of that is a long way of saying it worked out that we were able to found the company and stay primarily headquartered here in Australia. But that said, it does come with significant limitations, because for that North American market and basically every overseas market, maybe aside from Southeast Asia, you need boots on the ground, and you need people there to manage the relationships. Again, it's not universal advice because every market is different. And obviously now with the advent of AI, things are changing rapidly. But I think you just need to think very carefully about how it is that you interact with customers. And in the supply chain space, it's enterprise, it's very trust driven, it's very human to human still. So that's a big reason that we need to have enough resources to manage overseas growth.
Absolutely. Love that founder grit story of chasing the VC through the hallways. I think we've all done it. It worked out well for you. It hasn't always worked out that way for me. They just kind of look at me funny and walk away, but we keep on chasing. We will keep on chasing. And that's the way the game works. Now, you've kind of touched on a little bit about what your business is about, and you're maybe a little bit different to some of the guests that we've had on here, in that you are not kind of one-to-one travel. You're an adjacent industry around supply chain, around logistics. But we connected over a couple of the podcasts that you'd listened to, and you had some really interesting thoughts on those. But just to get us going, tell us a little bit about the company, what it does. And I know you've got some pretty impressive customers here in Australia. Maybe tell us a little bit about those as well.
Well, what Adiona does is tries to tie together efficiency for delivery fleets primarily with sustainability outcomes. So when we first started, we wanted to do a socially positive technology play. We didn't really know what it was, and I'll tell you a little bit of the backstory later. But the biggest consideration is it needed to be something that was technology-enabled emissions reduction was what we wanted to do. And how we did that, we were very open-minded to doing. But in terms of getting up and running, from a technology side of things, it was about how do we tie those things to financial outcomes? Because at the enterprise level, and especially, I know it doesn't even seem like that long ago, but 6 years ago when we started, sustainability people really didn't have a seat at the boardroom table back in those days. That's changed dramatically in the last few years. They do have more of a voice globally in boardrooms. But at the time, it really wasn't a thing. So we had to say, okay, how do we use financial efficiency for delivery fleets? How do we use reduction of kilometers traveled, reduction of vehicles required, optimization of all of those resources to then drive a sustainability improvement. And by combining those together and making it really easy to use, we're allowing companies like Australia Post, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Capital Transport, all sorts of brands that you would know, and then many others that you wouldn't know, to benefit from reduced fleets to do the same amount of delivery work, which reduces the amount of emissions that they create, reduced amount of labor to do those things too, which is very important in the modern market because hiring for any kind of manual labor job is getting harder and harder to do. There's a massive supply crunch in labor in supply chain. I think in the US is 450,000 supply chain jobs that have gone unfilled still. So, efficiency and automation is something that in supply chain, nobody's scared of. Nobody's worried that it's going to take their jobs because there's just so much to do and so few people to actually do it. And we said, if we can tie those together for those types of companies, we can create the outcomes that we want in emissions reduction and abatement, and then also make it financially appealing for those companies. And we call it a triple win, a win for the business, win for the environment, and then a win for the people on the front lines too, because everything that we do, especially in terms of the AI that we develop, we call it ethical AI development. We're always thinking about how is this going to impact the people who are working with the technology at the front line.
For sure. And I love that positioning of, your sustainability almost by stealth, by, this is a great business decision for the company to make. And the outcome happens to be also sustainably driven. And however we get that sustainability message through and into the practice of businesses, I'm all for, and well done on finding that pathway to convincing companies. Now, you mentioned a little bit about the backstory, and I'm fascinated as to kind of how you've ended up in this area in general and the founding story of the company. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, let's all think of ourselves in the pre-COVID world versus the post-COVID, right? So work from home is now very common for a lot of office jobs. It wasn't nearly as common in 2019. And even then, if you think about the different types of workforces and different types of labor, there's an enormous amount of people who work in location-based industries. When I say location-based industries, I mean, yeah, sure, a lot of white-collar jobs can do what they do from anywhere, but there's a lot of people in hospitality, accommodation. They work in hotels, they work in restaurants, the service industry. Healthcare is a huge one, massive, people who need to physically turn up to a hospital. You can't do that remotely. Construction, site maintenance, field services. All of these people that are out on the transport network, on the roads, on our trains, on our buses every day to do what they do. And they're absolutely critical. And another wonderful thing that COVID taught us is how important those people are. So my sister, being from Boston, my sister has always worked in retail and in hospitality. And at the time when I founded Adiona, she was working at a grocery store, so like the equivalent of a Woolies in the US. She was going past 3 instances of that exact same grocery chain to get to the one that she worked at. And how many people do you know that are working in a job that is, like that, where they're doing something that they could be doing at a different location closer to home, but because there were no jobs open at the one close to them, they took a job further away. Great example was when I was out doing validation and interviews with people. I met a guy who lived in the Blue Mountains, basically in Sydney, and was traveling 2 hours on the train every day to work at a McDonald's at Circular Quay. Now, that's 2 hours of his day each way, 4 hours a day to work at a job that was paying effectively minimum wage. It's ridiculous. And we all know that. We all know it's completely inefficient, right? But how do you solve it? And that's what I wanted to solve. So this is another just founder story that I love telling and that you'll probably appreciate, which is I came up with some concepts around it. I was validating those concepts at different places. I met my co-founder, who's a PhD in computer science with a specific focus on optimization and machine learning. He was like, oh yeah, that's something that can be done. He was so confident from a researcher and an academic perspective, like, oh yeah, easy, no problem. I can solve that for you. And I was like, oh, really? Okay. He said, yeah, but one of the problems is that a lot of that stuff is very hypothetical. You don't know what it's actually going to be like until you get out there in the real world. And so I said, cool, I'll go out and get some real data. So how I went out and got real data is I put on a nice blazer, nice jacket, got myself a clipboard, and I walked into 20 different Kohl's grocery stores in Sydney, all around the Sydney metro area. And I just started asking employees where they commuted from, effectively asking them where they live. But I said, you don't have to tell me your address. I'm just doing a survey on commuting. Can you tell me what suburb you commute from? And I collected up that data set of over 200 people across these, maybe 19 stores, got kicked out of 3 stores, So maybe, yeah, of course. Maybe the biggest surprise is that it was only 3 stores that, this random guy walked in and started walking around asking people surveys. But it was a rich enough data set that we were able to show is that by re-optimizing that workforce, effectively people doing stocking and stuff that could be transportable to the other stores in the network, you can reduce the aggregate commute time by 31%. And you think about the amount of travel time on the network that could offset at scale, with Coles having 90,000 employees across Australia, Woolies having like 140,000 employees across Australia. Enormous amount of potential travel time on the network. But of course, what's the benefit to the business? Why would a business care? Recruitment, training, and time to productivity. So businesses like that, and again, this is important in the travel industry and hospitality and accommodation. You have high churn rates. It's obviously a lot of times it's visa holders, it's students, it's people who are looking for a better job somewhere else when they can find it, and they're just taking this job temporarily. So you've got a high churn rate. Something like 20% per year of that grocery workforce churns. So they spend an enormous amount of money and time training them, recruiting them, hiring, onboarding. The time to productivity takes a while. So by keeping people in their job longer, by giving them a preferable location, you can reduce those costs. Long story short, already been a long story, but we went down that path. We got pretty far. We got a lot of interest from some big organizations in Australia, but the human resources systems, the recruitment systems, the HR, infrastructure that they use, it was really a square peg in a round hole. We were blocked at that point. And at that time, we were starting to run out of money. We were starting to run out of resources. I was self-funding the whole thing. I didn't have any investment at that point. So that's when we pivoted into logistics, and we realized that there was a bit more of a urgent opportunity with a round peg and a round hole that we could exploit.
For sure. It's so interesting. I've done some consulting with some reasonably large size companies and come up against some of those HR roadblocks myself, actually, in trying to help them drive efficiencies with AI into their own systems. It's a problem, that legacy tech, to make it useful in the new world, or to change the mindset of the people that are in those positions, that maybe there's something better out there and it's worth making that leap. Fascinating kind of road to get to where you're going. And logistics is complicated, right? It's such a super complicated thing. And I've got, one of my best mates runs a trucking company, medium-sized trucking company, country Australia, pretty old school. And, since I've been fascinated by AI, I've always looked at his business, and every time I see him, I hammer him with like, hey, you could be doing this in a much simpler way, a better way. It should be more efficient. And he always says, you got no idea, Tone. Like, you really, that's not how business works. It's complicated. Most of it's in my head. And it would never work out that way. But you're kind of doing it even with companies at a much larger scale, and I find that fascinating. But do you come up against those objections often?
Yeah, a lot of these companies are managing by exception, right? It's whatever hair on fire problem they have today that they're primarily focusing on, which is unfortunate, because then oftentimes the messaging around holistic efficiency and the entire organization and system can get buried, from the day-to-day operational stuff that they have to deal with. And it is so super complicated because you have so many moving parts and variables. You think of like a company that needs to deliver pallets of food product to somewhere, right? So you've got to deal with temperature control and sanitization and all this stuff just to manage those types of products. And then you've got to deal with all the timing for the different docks, because you can't turn up and deliver a pallet of product to a cafe in the middle of their breakfast rush. They'll just literally turn you away, and then you've wasted all that time going there. You literally can't turn up to a Woolies, and go on their loading dock if there's 3 other trucks there. So the orchestration of these delivery movements is enormously complicated, which is awesome for us because it makes it a really ripe problem statement for AI.
Is the data that you're dealing with already very well structured? I think this is kind of something we hear a lot about in travel, is like, wow, yeah, okay, AI can do all these amazing things, but with the way that the data is orchestrated in travel, good luck. Like, it is just, siloed data in all different types of places, not well structured, built to do one certain thing and not much else. How is it that in logistics, which I would have thought would have been, even more archaic, have you been able to find the data and orchestrate it in a way that it's useful for AI to manipulate it in the way that can be used effectively?
Well, our first foray into AI, and this is going back to 2021, was to build a deep learning model, a pipeline deep learning model that could normalize all these different types of logistics data. And the good thing about supply chain and logistics is that it is a real world thing. This is something where you have physical objects, atoms and molecules that are moving around the world. They start and as a raw material. So, you look at the guitar behind you that we were just talking about. It's got wood, it's got metal, it's got plastic, it's got paint, right? Each one of those items started as a raw material in the ground somewhere, was mined out, was sent to a manufacturing facility, was fashioned into something, was then sent to an additional manufacturing facility, finished, sent to a distribution location, sent to a store, sent to your house. We get it, right? But the cool thing is that basically any physical object in your house has gone through that process in some way, shape, or form. And the process is effectively the same, but the way it's represented in a software system, which I'm being generous to say a software system, because a lot of those companies were still operating on paper, right? So the way it's represented as information, as data, whether it's paper or digitally, can vary a lot. But the cool thing is that connection between your data layer and your physical real world movement of items and goods, the atomic level is all the same. So then you have to then, find ways, and this is where AI becomes really powerful, to say, okay, cool. I understand, if I'm an AI system, I understand the process of how these things move through the world. If you give me an arbitrary data set, some new data set, if I've been trained appropriately on all of these other data sets, which of course that was the first thing we did, was collate, millions and millions of rows of training data from different types of organizations, train the model, and then the model says, cool, you give me a new data set from a new company that just does things in a totally different way, I can apply my knowledge of how the overall system works to then figure out the labels and the categories of different data. And then obviously we can ingest it into our system and start to manipulate it and do optimizations and things like that. And so from a travel perspective, regardless of whether you're working with an airline or a bus company or a cruise ship company, all of those systems are intended to have people moving through them, staying in places for a certain amount of dwell time. Maybe there's an accommodation, maybe there's not. But the physical process is always going to be the same. It's just a matter of then how do you translate it?
Yeah, for sure. Now, one of the first projects I did post, the release of generative AI, I did a study with some of the first movers of people who were using the technology in interesting ways. And one of those was actually a logistics problem. It was pickups for a tour operator who was quite near a significant site in the world. So 80% of people who arrive in this destination are going to that site. And so that's who this tour operator was servicing. And so they would have upwards of 30 different buses going out around doing hotel pickups around, a reasonably large city that had some traffic issues. And so every day prior to finding a solution was just a nightmare. So the ops manager would come in, the buses would head out. Immediately, someone would have slept in at Hotel 1, which means that Hotel 2, 3, 4, 5, and all those customers are now going to get picked up 20 minutes later than they were told. And of course, after 10 minutes of waiting, they would call and say, "Where's my bus?" And so in the operations center was just the phones ringing for 4.5 hours every morning saying, where's my driver? And rather than build a route optimization system, the solution they came up with was a communication system. Okay, so that the driver could then send a message into a system and say, this person slept in, I'm going to be 10 minutes late everywhere. And that would then push out a message to everybody else saying, ding, the customer would get a ping on their phone saying, hey, 10 minutes delayed, don't come down for an extra 10 minutes. We'll be there at 8:40 instead of 8:30. And to me, that was genius, right? And that business, Tour Optima, is now one of the hot travel startups of 2025, according to FocusWire. And, they're solving a real problem, but they solved it in a communications way. Like, how big is communications versus the actual solving the logistical issue? Because, maybe your technology could have found a different route for the bus driver to get back on track, for example. Like, have you come up against those issues?
Oh yeah, it's enormous. And that's a great example in terms of how communication is so powerful, especially because the same people typically picking up the phone to deal with the customer inquiry are the same people that are trying to pick up the phone from that driver, trying to solve the problem. So that's an enormous reason that communication piece they built is so critical to then free up the dispatcher and the people working at headquarters to then solve the problem, work with the driver, which is what they should be doing to solve the root cause. And instead of solving the root cause, they're dealing with picking up the phone for angry customers, which doesn't solve anything. It just informs them, right? So love it. I love examples like that. And that's massively growing in the delivery logistics space. I don't know the last time you got something from Australia Post, but they don't really give you much of a time window like an ETA, right? Well, there's a reason that they can't give you an ETA, and it's because they don't know. And if you're not optimizing the route and pre-planning exactly stop by stop, you can't give an ETA, which is why, the Amazon effect, Amazon gives great ETAs because they built their own technology, which is very competitive to what we do. A lot of what we do is giving non-Amazon companies that Amazon experience because you can reduce the amount of resources you need. But the next layer is saying, okay, cool. Well, now I'm using 100 vans instead of 120. But now I know where each van is going, when they're going to arrive at that destination. And exactly like that example you gave, if there's a disruption in the network, cool, we can pick that up. We know where they are based on GPS. We can have a threshold that says if they're running more than X amount of minutes late, fire off a message to everybody downstream with their new ETA. And that type of experience is relatively new to logistics and delivery, but once that genie is out of the bottle and you experience it for yourself, there's no going back, right? We're all used to now watching on DoorDash or Uber Eats, you see the courier real time on the map. We all want that. And we want that for our parcels too. So, well and truly that genie is out of the bottle. It'll never go back in. And, like you said, there's different ways. The communication piece is so important because it just puts people at ease. It calms them down, and then they're not hassling you on the phone. And then likewise, the optimization piece is critical to enable that, communication piece to be really accurate.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, your business started pre the release of generative AI through, the ChatGPT kind of revolution. So, and your co-founder was already deep into machine learning and AI. How much has your business changed through the release of new large language models and generative AI technology versus where it was in the beginning? Or are you still more reliant on the native tech that you built? Because I believe you got patents, etc., around what you built in those early days. So where does your business sit now? Is it leveraging both, still relying on the old patents, or where are you at?
Great question. And I'll be really honest, for people who want to hear this or maybe hate to hear it, we had to throw out a bunch of stuff that we'd worked on that ChatGPT did better. And we were like, yep, okay, well, that's the way the world works. And sometimes they leapfrog you. And we're better off using that than we are trying to continue to fight, the salmon upstream. So yes, we've thrown away some stuff that we built and just decided it was more cost effective and to use alternative things. But then some of the other things that we do are very logistics specific. For example, some of the patents that we have are around the closed feedback loop. So courier goes out, that exact example we were just talking about, right? So you've got a driver that goes out and, person sleeps in 10 minutes and the whole thing goes late. Okay, cool. You know that exact customer is the one who's causal. They're the one that slept late. If you see them come up in another manifest in the future, you might be wise to say, this person may have a history of being constantly late. Maybe I'm going to apply that data into my routing and create a buffer. Now, I'm not saying that that's something you necessarily need to do. I'm just saying as an idea, conceptually, that kind of makes sense, right? Now, imagine if you can do that for billions of parcel movements. Same idea. Every time I go up to this house, it takes me longer to get in because the access door is broken, or it's a multi-level apartment building and it says it's supposed to be open, but it never is. We're tracking all of that data from the proof of delivery success and the photos and all that. And then you close that loop and feed it back into the predictive model. So that's something that still an LLM can't touch and only our proprietary tech can do. Will that change in the future? Maybe. But I think because what we do is so specific and so niche, it'll be protectable for quite some time. It'll be very hard to apply a generalized LLM model to something like what we do.
Yeah, for sure. Now, you say generalized and niche, but one of the big opportunities that I guess a lot of people jumped on in the generative AI age in travel was trip planning And trip planning has a logistics element to it, and what you are doing and is all around logistics and around optimization of timings, and some have done a great job of kind of working in, how long it might take to walk from here to here, or, how long you might spend here. Is your technology able to be applied to those types of problems? Is it service to the end user as an API that they can configure, or are you a service provider and you go in and you take your technology and adapt it to a customer's business? How does it actually work with a customer?
Yeah, great question. So we are a software as a service business primarily, meaning that what we license is the access to the software, and then we charge a consumption-based model. So how much they use it, how many locations they go to, and that type of thing. And then with that comes some inclusion to the model adapting automatically to what it is they do. But yes, there's an element of customization and being able to work with them. We work through a number of different types of partners, like consulting partners. We don't want to necessarily be focused on the consulting ourselves. So for instance, we have partnerships with companies like KPMG, where they can come in and use our platform with that customer, do the consultative piece, the customization piece, and then we are a bit more hands off in that. And it's always a bit of a mix. And what we are looking, and one of the reasons that I find travel really interesting is because there are so many applications that are so aligned with that, like going back to what we were talking about before, the atomics of how people move and how goods move. They're all very similar through the physical world. So I think that there's a massive application that we can unlock. Easy example is, a project that we just started talking about and hopefully we'll be working on soon around school buses, but not your typical school bus routing, more the day trip school route, routing. So, a school will call up the bus company and say, we're taking these kids on an excursion to X museum on X day, and we need to have so many buses available. Well, if you're a bus company, how do you manage 20 different schools all going on excursions at different times and making sure that those buses are also then back in time for their daily actual school runs? So, you can imagine that applied in almost so many different use cases in the tourism and travel business.
I'm laughing because my daughter comes home with a real life example every excursion she goes on. They never get back in time. Never. I don't think once have they ever got back in time. So that is a real issue that I hear about, probably 4 times a year each excursion. So that's true. I've only got a couple of minutes left, but we have kind of brainstormed over LinkedIn, chatting together a couple of other travel examples. So you mentioned kind of things like when cruises can't enter port because of poor weather. And another one I've thought of, kind of during this conversation is that the way that we move is not necessarily linked. So all our flights might be linked, but if we're catching a bus to a train to a flight, those things aren't linked. And I think there's probably some interesting implications in there for travel in the type of technology you provide.
Yeah, and we were talking about agentic AI, right, as being the next wave of the ability to allow an enabled agentic AI system, so a system that can make decisions, that can be given a goal or a target, and then make decisions to achieve that target. If your target is strictly on-time compliance, like I need to get there, I can't accommodate a change in my flights, I can't accommodate anything. Cool, okay, then you've got a priority. It's like an SLA compliance, service level agreement, right? Where you're saying, got to be there, no changes allowed, all costs allowed, right? But then you've got people like my parents-in-law who are like, we could be a day late as long as they're retired. If I'm going to get a $400 voucher from the airline, cool, I'll be a day late. What if you could automate that? And from an airline perspective, you could actually let people give you their preferences and then optimize your routing using agentic systems that then accommodate for everybody's unique constraints. Because you know how it is right now, they treat us all the same. And then they ask you and they say, well, can I get a volunteer to take a delay or a standby or whatever? What if you could automate that process just so that you're stripping out so much of the inefficiency, and then the network can run better? So I see there being a massive opportunity in that space.
I really love that example. I really do. Like, to have kind of a contract that sits in the background that says these are what I will accept, in certain circumstances, and then you just actually get that text message, before you've even left to the airport, that, hey, don't go to the airport today. Here's $400. We'll see you tomorrow. I think is bloody genius, and airports should be all over that. Richard, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much for jumping on today. But if people are interested in what you've had to say and want to connect with you and maybe explore your system, how can they best get in contact with you?
So our website is Adiona Tech, Adiona is the Roman goddess of the return journey. So maybe that's an easy way to remember it, or at least a little bit of a mnemonic. Adionatech.com. And yeah, we're based in Sydney, but we operate globally. So we encourage anybody who's interested in this space to reach out and have a chat with us.
Perfect.
For
Then,
having
because
us on.
no worries, you're on LinkedIn. That's where we've been discussing. So you can also find Richard there. Thanks so much again for your time today. Been a fascinating conversation. Hope everyone out there has enjoyed it. If you have enjoyed it, we have lots of other conversations like this happening all the time. Please hit subscribe on the service that you're listening to, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and you'll be the one who hears them first. Thanks so much for your time today. Thanks for listening in, and we'll catch you all for another one soon.
AI, in the travel game we go. Got that AI on the low, taking flights to and fro, booking trips in a snap.